The day the HOA took his dog was the day everything changed. They thought it was a simple mistake. They were wrong. On a quiet morning, Daniel watched his old German Shepherd, Ranger, rest near the porch of his countryside home. Ranger was calm, disciplined, and unusually alert for his age. Neighbors often whispered about the dog's serious gaze, but Daniel never explained why. He only smiled and said Ranger had lived a long life of service. What no one knew was that this story would soon force the entire neighborhood to face the truth. A black HOA truck rolled in without warning. Two board members stepped out with clipboards and confident smiles. They claimed Ranger violated community rules. No warning. No discussion. Just papers and authority. Daniel tried to speak, but they cut him off, saying the dog would be returned once paperwork was reviewed. Ranger didn't bark. He simply looked at Daniel, waiting for a command that never came. As the truck drove away, Daniel stood frozen. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with fear. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was a chapter of Daniel's life no one knew about. A chapter buried under silence, discipline, and loyalty. The HOA believed they had power. They believed rules were everything. But they had no idea who Ranger truly was or what they had just taken, and when that truth surfaced, everything would change. The HOA office buzzed with routine confidence as Ranger was led inside. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and no one noticed how still the dog was. He sat exactly where told, eyes forward, posture perfect. One board member joked that the dog looked trained beyond normal. Another laughed and said rules were rules. They logged Ranger as an unregistered animal and locked the door. Back at home, Daniel didn't call the police. He didn't argue online. He sat quietly, staring at the empty porch. His hands trembled as memories returned, long nights, sharp commands, and moments where Ranger's obedience meant survival. Daniel whispered Ranger's name under his breath, hoping somehow the dog could hear him. That afternoon, an HOA intern tried to move Ranger into a different holding area. She tugged the leash lightly. Ranger didn't resist. He repositioned himself instantly, scanning exits, remaining calm. The intern felt uneasy. This wasn't normal behavior. She reported it to the board, but they dismissed her concerns. They had handled animals before. This was no different. What they didn't know was that Ranger had once worked in environments louder than storms and darker than night. He had been trained to stay calm when chaos ruled. He wasn't confused. He was waiting, and as Daniel finally stood up and made a single phone call, the HOA unknowingly set a countdown in motion, one that would expose a truth they could never undo. The call Daniel made wasn't to complain. It was to inform. His voice was steady, respectful, and brief. He gave a name, a service number, and one sentence that made the man on the other end fall silent. Daniel hung up and returned to his chair, trusting the system Ranger once served. At the HOA office, confidence slowly cracked. A uniformed officer arrived, not with anger, but with questions. He asked to see the dog. When Ranger was brought out, the officer's posture changed. He didn't approach casually. He stood straight. Respectful. He noticed the stance, the discipline, the focus. He asked where the dog came from. Minutes later, another call came in. Then another. The board members whispered nervously. They checked their records again, searching for errors. The intern watched quietly as the room shifted from authority to uncertainty. Ranger remained still, unbothered, eyes forward, as if he'd been here before. Daniel arrived soon after. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Ranger and gave a soft command. Ranger responded instantly. The officer nodded slowly, already understanding more than the HOA ever had. That was when the question was finally asked aloud. What exactly is this dog's history? The answer would silence the room and redefine everything the HOA thought they controlled. Daniel took a breath before answering. He never liked speaking about the past. Ranger had been more than a partner. He had been protection, precision, and loyalty in places Daniel rarely spoke of. The officer explained it gently for him. Ranger was a retired military working dog. Years of service. Specialized training. Documented missions. Honorably released, the HOA board members stared at the papers now placed on the table. Their authority dissolved with every line they read. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't a rule violation. This was a mistake with consequences far beyond fines or apologies. One board member tried to speak, but words failed. The intern covered her mouth in shock. The officer reminded them calmly that military working dogs are protected, respected, and never to be seized without proper coordination. Silence filled the room. Daniel finally knelt beside Ranger, resting a hand on his back. Ranger leaned slightly into him, calm as ever. The bond between them was unmistakable. Years of trust in a single moment, the HOA's power was gone. Their confidence shattered. They had taken something sacred without knowing its value. And now, every neighbor would soon know exactly what had happened, but the final twist hadn't arrived yet, because the story didn't end with Ranger coming home, it ended with the HOA facing something they could never ignore again. News spread fast. Neighbors gathered, whispering with disbelief. The same HOA that enforced rules without mercy had crossed a line no one defended. Emails flooded in. Meetings were called. Questions were asked that had never been allowed before. Authority was finally being challenged. Daniel didn't celebrate. He walked Ranger home slowly, letting him pause, observe, and breathe familiar air. The porch felt alive again. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to smile. Not because he'd won, but because Ranger was safe. Days later, the HOA issued a formal apology. Policies were rewritten. Training was mandated. The board members who laughed before now spoke carefully. They avoided Daniel's eyes when they passed him. Not out of fear, but out of understanding, Ranger returned to his quiet routine. Sitting. Watching. Guarding nothing but memories. Neighbors now greeted him with respect. Children waved. Adults nodded. They finally saw what Daniel had always known, but one final moment remained. One last reminder of why power must always come with humility. At the next HOA meeting, Daniel was asked to speak. He stood calmly and said only one sentence: "This dog served when it mattered most." No one interrupted. No one argued, and the room stayed silent long after he sat down. Time passed, but the lesson stayed. The HOA no longer acted without listening. Fines dropped. Complaints softened. Something fundamental had changed. Authority had learned restraint. And respect had replaced control. Ranger aged gracefully. His steps slowed, but his presence remained strong. Daniel spent evenings beside him, sharing quiet moments that felt earned. No cameras. No attention. Just peace. One afternoon, a new family moved in. Their child asked Daniel why everyone treated his dog differently. Daniel smiled and said some heroes don't wear medals anymore. They simply rest. The HOA president later admitted privately that taking Ranger had been the greatest mistake of their tenure. Not because of consequences, but because it revealed how easily power can blind people to humanity. Ranger lay in the sun that evening, eyes half closed, breathing steady. Daniel watched him with gratitude. Not for the protection. Not for the history. But for the reminder that dignity matters, even in silence. The neighborhood would remember this story for years. Not as gossip, but as a warning, because sometimes, the smallest actions expose the biggest truths, and this story had one final moment left to share. Ranger passed peacefully months later, surrounded by quiet and respect. The neighborhood paused that day. No rules were enforced. No notices posted. Just understanding. A small memorial appeared near Daniel's porch, left anonymously. No words were needed, the HOA never forgot. New members were trained with this story. Not as shame, but as guidance. Authority must listen. Power must pause. And respect must come first. Daniel kept Ranger's collar by the door. A reminder of loyalty that never demanded recognition. Only understanding. When asked about the incident, Daniel simply said it taught people who they were before they remembered who they should be, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.